The icy wind of the subantarctic latitudes knew no barriers, howling over the black waters and crashing into the jagged rocks of the Auckland Islands. Captain Thomas Musgrave stood on the frozen shore, feeling the damp cold penetrate his heavy woolen jacket and chill him to the bone. Francois Reynal, the captain's companion, watched silently as the water slowly engulfed the wreckage of their ship, carrying away the remnants of their former life. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone understood that the situation was rapidly and irreversibly deteriorating. The horizon was completely empty, ravaged by endless storms, and Captain Musgrave knew this deep down inside. The other 3 crew members huddled around the boxes washed ashore, trying to shelter from the piercing wind behind the slippery planks. They looked at each other and saw a primal fear that could not be hidden behind bravado or seafaring experience. The expedition began in the port of Sydney, where the air smelled of tar, spices, and boundless opportunities for daring entrepreneurs. Thomas Musgrave, an experienced sailor, and Francois Reynal, an adventurer with an entrepreneurial streak, pooled their meager capital for an ambitious goal. They purchased a schooner, intending to sail to the lost southern islands in search of tin and silver deposits that promised huge profits. Their eyes burned with the fire of discovery that drove people to leave safe harbors and challenge the ocean. After hiring 3 more reliable sailors, they felt like an invincible team, ready to overcome any difficulties on their way to riches. At that moment, none of them yet understood that this self-confidence would become their main curse. The anchors could not withstand the tremendous pressure and began to drag along the rocky bottom, inexorably pulling the ship toward the sharp reefs. The crew panicked and rushed around the deck, trying to do something, but their efforts were insignificant in the face of the hurricane's power. They shouted orders, but the wind tore the words from their mouths, turning them into meaningless noise. Panic spread faster than the cold, paralyzing the will and forcing people to perform chaotic, useless actions. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening, but their instinct for self-preservation was already screaming about an imminent catastrophe. A deafening, bone-jarring blow shook the ship from keel to keel, knocking everyone off their feet onto the slippery deck. The wood creaked with a terrifying sound as the schooner's hull struck underwater rocks that tore through the plating like paper. Water poured into the hold in an icy stream, flooding the remaining provisions and extinguishing the last hopes of saving the ship. In a single second, they lost their home, their transport, and their protection from the hostile outside world. There was no turning back. The ship was firmly stuck on the reefs, doomed to slow destruction by the waves. At that moment, each of them realized that the most terrible ordeal was just beginning. But they all understood that the situation was hanging by a thread, and any mistake would lead to instant death in the icy water. They were separated not only by the raging elements, but also by doubts that the shore would be more hospitable than the sinking ship. On that day, their personal hell began, from which not everyone was destined to escape. Crossing to shore through the boiling foam of the surf was the first act in their desperate struggle for survival. The small boat, overloaded with people and hastily gathered supplies, was tossed about by the waves like a splinter in a whirlpool. Cold water flooded the sides, instantly soaking their clothes and hampering the movements of their numb limbs. Each stroke of the oar required superhuman effort, muscles burning with tension, lungs bursting from lack of oxygen. They were not afraid of death at that moment. They were afraid of not reaching solid ground, which seemed to be their only salvation. But the horizon of their hopes narrowed to a few meters of rocky beach, hidden by a veil of rain. When the keel of the boat finally scraped against the rocks, the people tumbled into the icy water, barely able to stand on their feet from exhaustion. They dragged the boat ashore with their last ounce of strength, knowing that it was their only means of transportation in the future. The wind knocked them off their feet, throwing handfuls of wet sand and small stones into their faces, preventing them from even opening their eyes. They huddled under an overhanging rock, shivering, wet, and completely defenseless against the fury of subantarctic nature. At that moment, none of them yet understood how hostile this piece of land would prove to be. At first, it seemed like salvation, but soon it turned into a slow, sophisticated death sentence. Leaving the men by the fire, the captain and Reinal went along the shore to assess the condition of the ship stuck on the reefs. The sight was depressing. The waves were methodically destroying the hull, tearing off pieces of the plating and scattering them across the bay. Reinal, taking on the role of quartermaster, carefully counted each item, understanding its true value. He began to realize that there would be no help, and survival depended solely on their ability to use these scraps. From that moment on, the expedition was over, and the grueling routine of survival began. They began to build a temporary shelter from the wreckage of the ship that had been washed ashore by the night tide. The work progressed slowly, their numb hands refusing to hold heavy stones and slippery, salt-soaked planks. Physical exhaustion was compounded by a constant feeling of hunger that gnawed at them from within, robbing them of their last reserves of strength. Each subsequent step and blow of the axe became heavier than the previous one, requiring a tremendous effort of will. Nature made no distinction between them. It simply subjected their bodies to systematic destruction. This was not the end of their suffering, but only the prologue to a long and painful play. None of them yet understood the scale of what was happening, but despair had already taken root in their hearts. After a week of continuous rain and piercing winds, the illusions began to finally dissipate, leaving room for the naked truth. The Auckland Islands were not just inhospitable, they were actively hostile to any manifestation of human life. The dense forest covering the slopes consisted of twisted, intertwined trunks that had to be literally chopped through with an axe. Attempts to venture deeper into the island in search of shelter or food ended in torn clothing and complete exhaustion. At that moment, the captain finally realized that they were trapped in a natural trap with no chance of an easy escape. The horizon was empty, and he knew it, feeling the full weight of responsibility for the fates of others. The problem of obtaining food became incredibly acute when the ship's meager supply of biscuits became covered with green mold. The island was teeming with sea lions, but hunting these massive and aggressive animals proved to be a deadly dangerous endeavor. The first attempts to club a seal nearly cost one of the sailors his life when the wounded animal lunged at him. They had to use the last of their gunpowder, which they dried over a fire with incredible caution. When they managed to get their first meat, they ate it almost raw, shivering from the cold and greedily swallowing the tough pieces. It was at that moment that they ceased to be civilized people, succumbing to the primitive instinct of survival. The seal meat diet quickly took its toll, causing stomach upset and severe weakness in the entire crew. The meat lacked essential vitamins, and the constant dampness and cold exacerbated the physical exhaustion of their bodies. People's gums began to bleed, and old wounds and abrasions became inflamed, refusing to heal in this rotten climate. Reinal, trying to save the team's sanity, proposed an ambitious plan: to build a real, sturdy house instead of their miserable shack. He understood that having a permanent, warm shelter would give people a purpose and make them work together. This proposal was met with resistance from those who still believed in imminent rescue and did not want to waste their strength. They still hoped that someone was looking for them, but Reinal cruelly shattered these illusions, forcing them to face the truth. At first, it seemed like a death sentence, an admission of defeat, but then it became a lifeline. At that moment, everything depended on whether they could unite for the sake of common, hard work. The work of harvesting wood became a real torture. Blunt axes stuck in the wet, hard wood, bouncing off with a dull clang. People had to drag logs on their shoulders through slippery mud, sinking knee-deep into the peat slush. Each step became harder than the last, squeezing the last of their energy out of their exhausted bodies. The question was no longer whether everyone would survive, but how long they could hold out. A long journey filled with hardship awaited them, but now they were ready to face it head-on. From that day on, their real battle with the Arctic began, which was in no hurry to kill them, but simply waited for them to make a mistake. The construction of Epigway gave the colonists a false sense of security and the illusion that they had taken control of the situation. Having a roof over their heads and a constantly burning hearth created a semblance of comfort that contrasted sharply with the storm raging outside the walls. These primitive garments made them look like savages, but they protected them from the piercing damp wind and hypothermia. Each of his successes was perceived by the team as a small victory over indifferent nature, giving them a glimmer of optimism. They began to believe that their ingenuity could compensate for the lack of civilized tools. Psychological tension in the confined space grew, despite the captain's efforts to maintain a positive attitude. People began to annoy each other with trifles, loud breathing, sleeping habits, carelessly thrown words. Outbursts of unmotivated aggression became more frequent, requiring Masgrave to intervene harshly to prevent fights. No one wanted to take responsibility for creating conflicts, but the atmosphere in the house was electrified to the limit. They were separated not only by the icy desert outside the window, but also by the dull irritation caused by forced coexistence. The team began to slowly fall apart, and discipline could no longer hold back this process. In an attempt to preserve his sanity, Masgrave began keeping a diary, recording daily events and his dark thoughts. He had to write with seal blood, as he had long since run out of ink, and this fact added an eerie, primitive flavor to his entries. The pages of the diary became his only silent companion, to whom he could confide his growing fear and helplessness. He wrote about how the horizon was always empty, how there was no longer any hope of salvation from outside. At that moment, he did not yet understand that these entries would become a historical document of their incredible struggle. He wrote simply to prove to himself that he still existed as a rational being. During those long, dark nights, they finally understood that they had become hostages of a place that did not care about their suffering. No one heard their prayers. Their pleas for help dissolved in the howling wind, bringing no relief. Everything changed in a second when they realized that no one in the world cared about their fate anymore. From that moment on, they were no longer explorers waiting to be rescued. They became prisoners planning their escape. There was no turning back. They had to find a way out, or this island would become their nameless grave. It was the end of their illusions and the beginning of the most difficult stage of their survival. The winter of 1864 descended on the Auckland Islands with indescribable fury. Daylight hours were reduced to a few twilight hours, plunging the inhabitants of the Epigway into almost continuous, oppressive darkness. The temperature dropped so low that the moisture in their clothes turned to ice the moment they stepped outside. The frosty air took their breath away, and their hands went numb in minutes, refusing to obey their minds. Each step outside the shelter became harder than the last, requiring the mobilization of all their remaining strength. At that moment, Captain Masgrave began to seriously doubt that any of his men would live to see the spring thaw. Hunger took on new perverse forms when seals, their only source of food, virtually disappeared from the coast. The men had to wander for hours on the icy rocks, risking their lives for a chance bird or a handful of edible seaweed. Deprived of carbohydrates and vitamins, their bodies began to devour their own muscle tissue, turning strong sailors into walking skeletons. Their eyes were deeply sunken, their cheekbones covered with parchment-like skin, and their movements became slow and uncertain, like those of the very elderly. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone understood that death from exhaustion was imminent. They began to economize every movement, as if spending the last drops of precious fuel. Scurvy, their constant companion, had entered a severe stage, bringing with it unbearable physical torment. Their teeth wobbled in bleeding gums, preventing them from chewing the hard food they managed to obtain. Pain became their constant background noise, drowning out all other thoughts and desires except one: for it to stop. The most frightening thing was not the pain itself, but the realization that they were slowly rotting alive with no chance of recovery. Some were already calculating who would be the first victim of this merciless disease. The realization that they had been completely forgotten by the world weighed on them heavier than the snow on the roof of their hut. No one heard their cries, No one was looking for them in this God-forsaken part of the world's ocean. Help could only come by a miracle, and these exhausted people had long since stopped believing in miracles. From that moment on, the expedition was over, giving way to bare, instinctive survival at the limits of human capabilities. There was no way back. The past seemed like a distant dream that had never been real. It was the moment when they stopped hoping for outside help and turned their gaze inward. Death was very close, sitting with them by the fire, touching them with its icy fingers every night. When one of the sailors fell ill with a severe fever, the others silently watched him fade away, unable to help. The fear of becoming infected or being next paralyzed them, forcing them to turn away from their comrades' suffering. No one had prepared him for such an ordeal, but he endured, saving his own life and that of his crew. And although they still had a long way to go before they were truly saved, they knew that they had already survived the most terrible winter of their lives. Now they had to decide what to do with this life they had saved. Spring brought not the long-awaited warmth and rebirth to the Auckland Islands, but only endless torrential rains and thick fog. The ice on the rocks melted, turning the land around Epigway into an impassable, foul-smelling swamp teeming with small parasites. The days grew longer, but the gray, dim light only served to highlight the misery of their existence and physical exhaustion. Exactly 1 year had passed since the Grafton crashed into the reefs, and this anniversary weighed heavily on the sailors' hearts. They realized that no one was looking for them. Neither the ship's owners nor their families had long since written them off as dead. This realization was the cruelest blow, worse than any storm or bout of hunger. A depressing atmosphere of hopelessness hung over the hut when the captain announced his conclusions to the rest of the crew. At first, no one wanted to say it out loud, but Masgrave's words only confirmed what everyone had been thinking about during the long nights. The panic that had previously gripped them in moments of danger was now replaced by a dull, apathetic resignation to fate. Some sailors simply lay down on their bedding, refusing to get up and participate in the daily routine of survival. They were not afraid of death. They were afraid of not being found, of remaining to rot on this cursed piece of rock forever. The hope that had warmed them all winter had died, leaving behind only the cold ashes of despair. Reynal, seeing the team give up, tried to shake them up, reminding them of how much they had already overcome. He said that giving up now would mean betraying their own suffering and efforts of the past year. But his words fell on deaf ears, crashing against the wall of indifference that the exhausted minds of the sailors had built around themselves. No one wanted to take responsibility for continuing a senseless struggle against nature, which always wins. They were divided not only by the icy desert, but also by their different attitudes toward death. Some awaited it as a relief, while others still resisted. At that moment, discipline cracked, and it was impossible to patch it up with orders or persuasion. However, implementing this plan required tools and materials that they simply did not have. They needed to forge new nails, make saws, create a blacksmith's bellows from seal skins, and find a replacement for the rigging. But there was no turning back. Staying on the island meant certain and painful death. It was their first day of real, conscious resistance to fate, which they began with empty hands. And although the horizon was still empty, now they knew that they themselves would go beyond it. The transformation of the camp of desperate people into a makeshift shipyard was one of the most remarkable stages of their survival. Reynal, using his engineering skills and scraps of knowledge, oversaw the creation of a real forge from materials at hand. From seal skins, wooden hoops, and bones, he constructed bellows capable of pumping air into the hearth. A massive iron block, miraculously salvaged from the wrecked Grafton in the early days of the disaster, was used as an anvil. It was a pitiful, primitive production, but it worked, allowing them to heat and deform pieces of ship metal. At that moment, everything depended on how accurately they could recreate the tools necessary for shipbuilding. The work at the forge was hellish. The heat from the coals burned their faces, and the acrid smoke ate away at their inflamed eyes, causing bouts of suffocating coughing. Exhausted people, barely able to stand, took turns pumping the bellows and striking the red-hot iron with heavy hammers. They forged nails, bolts, and most importantly, primitive saws, without which it was impossible to cut the logs into planks. Each forged nail cost them incredible physical effort and was accompanied by moans of pain from torn muscles. They were not prepared for what would happen next, but their determination drove them forward, forcing them to forget their weakness. No one heard their cries of pain. They were drowned out by the ringing of metal, which became the anthem of their resistance. Masgrave, as the leader, took the burden of the decision upon himself, deciding that he and the two strongest sailors would go for help. The remaining two were to wait for them on the island, keeping the fire going and hoping for a successful outcome to this crazy voyage. The choice was made not out of personal sympathy, but solely out of pragmatic considerations. The boat had to be steered by the strongest. It was a moment that divided them, splitting the crew into those who would risk everything and those who would wait. Fear and hidden resentment could be seen in the eyes of those who remained, but they understood the logic behind this cruel decision. They were separated not only by the icy desert, but also by the realization that they might never see each other again. The farewell on the shore was short and dry, without unnecessary words or tears, for which they simply had no emotions left. Masgrave shook hands with those who remained, promising to return for them with a real ship, whatever the cost. Those who remained watched silently as their comrades pushed the heavy boat into the boiling surf. At that moment, they did not yet understand how agonizing the wait would be in the empty, frozen hut. There was no turning back. The boat caught the wind and began to slowly drift away from the shore. The horizon was empty, and Masgrave knew it as he steered his fragile vessel straight into the jaws of the unknown. Setting out into the open ocean in a homemade, clumsy boat was an act of pure, undiluted madness, dictated by absolute despair. The waves, which had seemed merely large from the shore, became colossal, moving mountains of water here on the water. The tiny vessel was tossed from side to side, its wooden hull creaking and groaning, threatening to fall apart with every blow of the elements. Masgrave clung to the tiller with his white knuckles, trying to keep the boat's bow facing the oncoming waves so it wouldn't capsize. At that moment, he finally understood that their lives were hanging by a thread that could snap at any second. At first, it seemed like a daring rescue plan, but now it had turned into an endless, exhausting nightmare. On the fifth day of sailing, the wind picked up to storm force, tearing their homemade sail to shreds like rotten paper. The boat lost control and began to drift dangerously sideways toward the waves, which meant it would inevitably capsize in the next few minutes. Masgrave and the sailors had to grab the oars, trying to level the boat and keep it afloat with superhuman effort. The last few miles were the hardest for them. The tension eased and their bodies, deprived of adrenaline, refused to obey. They could barely lift the oars. Their movements were weak and uncertain, but the approaching shore gave them strength. The boat slowly entered the quiet harbor of Port Adventure, where the water was as calm as a mirror after the fury of the open ocean. When the bottom of the boat touched the sandy bottom, they simply fell overboard, unable to take a single step on solid ground. From that moment on, they were no longer fugitives. They had returned to the world of men, having overcome the impossible. It was the end of their maritime nightmare, but not the end of their mission. The appearance of three ragged, emaciated men in Port Adventure caused a real shock among the local residents and authorities. They looked like ghosts risen from the depths of the sea, overgrown with thick beards, dressed in smelly sealskins, barely able to speak. Their story of a year and a half of survival on the Auckland Islands and a mad voyage in a homemade boat seemed like an incredible fabrication. But their physical condition and the boat itself, held together with bones and sewn with tendons, were irrefutable evidence of this fantastic story. Interestingly, while searching the island, the cutter's crew discovered the remains of another shipwreck, the Invercold. It turned out that they had crashed on the same island at the same time, just a few miles from Masgrave's camp. But for the survivors themselves, this fame was just an empty sound, unable to drown out the memories of the horror they had experienced. The world continued to live its busy life, but they were forever changed, carrying within them the mark of an icy void. No one knew what nightmares haunted them at night when they heard the sound of rain outside their windows. From that moment on, they were no longer explorers. They became bearers of a unique experience, bought at too high a price. There was no turning back. The carefree sailors of the past remained buried under the snow of the Auckland Islands. A long life lay ahead of them, but the shadow of the epigway would always be behind them. Nature did not try to kill them. It simply gave them a test, which they passed with flying colors. The story of the Grafton's crew went down in the annals of seafaring as one of the most outstanding examples of survival in extreme conditions. They spent 20 months on a desolate, harsh island without losing a single member of their 5-man crew. This was a unique achievement for the 19th century, when shipwrecks in such latitudes almost always meant the complete loss of the crew. The world continued to live, but for this piece of land, time stood still in its eternal cycle of storms and cold. Nature was not evil or vengeful, it was simply colossal in its indifference to fragile human life. No one heard the cries of those who died here before and those who would die after. This land remained silent. The Arctic and subarctic do not kill quickly. They do not pounce on their prey like a rabid predator. They act methodically, wearing down their victims with cold, breaking their will with isolation, and sapping their strength with a constant feeling of hunger. They simply wait for a person to make a mistake, give in to despair, or allow panic to destroy their discipline and sanity. And those who have survived this meat grinder know that victory over nature is always a temporary illusion. We can only delay our end by using our intellect and joining forces against the blind forces of nature. The question is not whether we will always survive, but how we will face this inevitable test. The story of the Grafton shipwreck is not just an adventure story with a happy ending. It is a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization is that separates us from primal chaos and brutality. When laws, stores, and warm homes disappear, man is left alone with his true nature, and it is up to them to decide whether to become beasts gnawing on the bones of their companions or to remain human beings building a ship out of rubbish. This is the main philosophy of survival at the edge of the world, far from prying eyes and help. Everything is decided here and now, within each of us. Their boat, sewn together from the remains of sails and hope, has become a symbol that there is always a way out, even when the situation seems completely hopeless. You just need to find the strength within yourself not to give up when the horizon is empty and no one is coming to help.